And don't forget to record the show, Damon.
Thanks, Gav.
Oh, sorry. A bit late. Sorry.
Gavin's the sort of guy that will remind you to use a safety belt after you're playing the car.
Yes, exactly.
So the bottom line of it is Schmitter's sanctity can transfer. That's the first thing we learned. And the second thing that we learned is that you can only get the advantage of Schmitter's sanctity if the seeds are planted within the 6th year. If it's in the 7th year, human intervention, you can't. And the third principle we learned is that if it's no longer available in the environment, then it's human intervention that's causing it to sustain itself, and then that is no longer allowed. And then anything that you've stored, transferred to cash, or used in terms of benefit becomes null and void. So at that particular point, the Gemara comes up with something strange, and it says, all of a sudden, out of the blue, it says, evidently wood is subject to Shemitah sanctity. So the thing of it is, like, it came completely out of context, that sentence. And the first time I was learning the Gemara, I thought, well, what are you talking about wood? You're talking about dyes, and you're talking about wood. What does wood have to do with Shemitah sanctity? What does it even have to do with dyes? So when I was looking at the Rashi and the Tosfot, it said that basically wood is compared to safflower and woad, which are dye products, because they're non-edibles. So according to Tosfot, they're non-edibles, and therefore wood is considered very similar and non-edible. It's a growth that's a non-edible. And therefore, if you want to say that dye stuffs is subject to Shemitah sanctity, and whatever you use for that is subject to those sort of constraints, then wood is also within that category and subject to the exact same constraints. So Rav is bringing a contradiction. I'm just telling you what we've covered so far. And he said, but there's a different brisa that said the leaves of cane reeds and the leaves of grapevines that one gathered from their field and put into a storage unit. If you gathered them for food, they have Shemitah sanctity. But if you gathered them for wood, in other words, for kindling a fire, they don't have Shemitah sanctity. So it's evident from this that wood doesn't have Shemitah sanctity. So Rav is saying, look, there's definitely evidence to the fact that it doesn't have Shemitah sanctity, and our particular Gemara is saying that it does. So how do you reconcile the two? So the first thing is, before we go to Rav's reconciliation, we have to read a bit of a commentary about him. And he said, listen, you resolve it in a very, very simple way. If you look in Vayikra, Leviticus chapter 25, verse 6, talks about the Shabbat produce of the land shall be yours to eat. So in other words, any activity that is similar to eating is subject to Shemitah sanctity. Anything that you don't use for eating is subject to Shemitah sanctity. But then the contradiction comes, well, then why would wood be subject to Shemitah sanctity in the first place when it's a non-edible? That's the question. And then why would dye stuffs be subject to Shemitah sanctity if it's a non-edible? Okay, we understand animal fodder because your animals eat it, or human food, because they're edibles. So we say, no, it's not about the fact that it's edible. It's about the fact that with it becoming edible, it has to fall within a certain category. So there's two categories. The one is food, and what resembles food, at which you can't use it past the time of bi'ur removal, is if the benefit and the consumption go relatively simultaneously. In other words, if I have to remove a product that has Shemitah sanctity by crushing it, destruction, or consuming it, then that is occurred at the same time as the benefit when eating. For example, if I took a high school Afrikaans book, and at the end of my matric year, I threw it in a dustbin and I burnt all my books, then in that particular case, the fire consumed them and the books were no longer beneficial. Okay? So so that's what you're dealing with consumption. Consumption can either mean to eat, or it's consumed by, meaning to destroy. So if you're consuming it, that steak no longer resembles steak, and you're getting the nutritional benefit as well. So the destructive act of the Shemitah produce is occurring in a kosher way while your body's getting the nutrition. If there's a delaying process and the benefit comes only after the consumption, then that wood you don't have to get rid of in your storage house. Why? Because it's not subject to Shemitah sanctity at all. So what we're saying is, in the case of wood that's collected, you've got no problem with Shemitah sanctity, because what happens is when you burn wood, it becomes charcoal. And if it's at the stage where you're burning wood and there's a lot of flames, if you put a piece of chicken on the braai there, you're going to burn and char the outside, but the inside is going to be still rare. And if the inner part is rare, not thoroughly cooked, then obviously if you cook it simultaneously until the flames die down, then you're not going to have any sort of successful braai. So what happens is you generally have to have the wood that gets reduced to the coal-like state, and then when it gets reduced to the coal-like state and the heat is consistent, but not so hot that it burns everything to pieces, but hot enough that it actually cooks food evenly, at that point you're getting benefit. But the benefit of the cooking only occurs after the wood has been consumed into coals. In other words, it's no longer recognizable as wood. So because the consumption is happening, or the destruction, before the benefit of the cooking, that means that that product is not subject to Shemitah sanctity. And Rav is using this as a proof, Kevin and Tzvi, that basically that wood can't be compared to dye stuffs, because with dye stuffs, the minute you heat dye in a cauldron and you put your fabric in, at the same time that the dye is dissolving, it's being absorbed in the clothing, and therefore that benefit is occurring at the same time as consumption, which means it's liable for Shemitah sanctity. And therefore, it's different to wood, where when you burn wood, you only get the benefit when they reduce to coals and there's an even temperature. So therefore, wood is not subject to Shemitah sanctity. But the other problem that's going to occur is that you can't then use dye stuff past the time of biur, because dye has got a process of permanence. Nobody dyes clothing or garments for temporary benefit, because the whole point is to dye it, is to actually have permanent clothing in the color you want. Because it wasn't exactly Woolworths and Edgar's in those days. So therefore, it's a problem, because if it's subject to Shemitah sanctity, then you're going to have to get rid of it when the climatic conditions have removed it, and it's not a perennial plant that can last through all the seasons, or the animals in the field have eaten it. So then you actually can't get the benefit of the dye stuffs, because it's got the Shemitah sanctity. So what would happen is, if you manage to find a particular dye that could outlast the Shemitah year in the 7th year, as it's a perennial plant, there's no problem with permanently dyeing it, because it might not gain Shemitah sanctity. Well, you certainly can get benefit from it in that case. The second factor is, if you manage to retard the dyeing process, or you use the dye in a way that it's not absorbing the color immediately, but it needs a couple of days under low temperature to absorb, then the destruction of the dye happens and the benefit only happens later. That's another way to deal with the issue. In other words, you either retard the benefit after the consumption, or you make sure that that plant is a perennial, and then you could use the dye stuff and it's not subject to biur. So Rav is just proving from this that it's actually not an issue as far as wood is concerned. Because if you look at the leaves of cane reeds and the leaves of grapevines, what matters about it is, are you using it for food, in other words, animal fodder, at which case it attains Shemitah sanctity and you can't keep it in your storage unit to where it's no longer available in the fields? Or are you using it to burn for firewood, at which case there's a delay in benefit, that the benefit only occurs after the consumption, and therefore they don't have Shemitah sanctity, and therefore you can store it as wood. So what happens is, if you have a plant that can be used both for wood as well as for animal fodder, It's on the intent of the gatherer to determine whether it attains Shemitah sanctity or not. Now, Arthur asked a very good question, and Gavin did, and Kevin did. And last time they were saying is that it doesn't seem as though even with eating, or Arthur asked this, and then Gavin added the texture to it, that there really is an immediate benefit. Why? Because basically when you eat food, you're consuming it and destroying it in its present form, yes, but the nutritional value is only occurring perhaps a half an hour, 40 minutes later, or even 2 hours later when your gastroenterological juices break it down, and it's absorbed in the body in its correct sort of nutritional state, etc., etc. And these sort of biochemical processes take a lot time. So therefore, your benefit might, especially if you're having low GI, etc., and it's not an immediate spike in blood sugar, or meat that takes hours to absorb. It's possible the nutritional benefit comes way after the consumption, okay, which was a very, very good question. And the reality is what is determined by it is not a small amount of time, but what is the visual benefit? Meaning, visually, when I see somebody consume it, there might be a lot going on biochemically within the body to be able to derive the benefit. But for all intents and purposes, that piece of chicken ain't coming back out, except in somebody's stool. Okay, so it's gone, and the benefit that your body has gotten is pretty much a fait accompli from a visual perspective. You don't see the process; it might be delayed, but visually, the point at which it's gone is already set in motion a process where you're going to get the benefit. With the fire on the other hand, you can see that when the wood is consumed to the point where it becomes cold like embers, and then you can only brow 40 minutes later, there's a visual delay in consumption to benefit, where you don't have that visual delay with eating. And how does that relate to dying? Is that, does it mean something significant to the garment, where the change of color actually, it's the benefit to the garment looking better or being in line with a fashion trend that makes you not be able to use that garment that has Shemitah sanctity? In other words, is it the visual benefit, or is it the financial benefit that it's worth more? So the bottom line is the Gemara is talking about the term appearance in this particular case. In the earlier part of Bava Kamma, it was talking about the value, the financial value. So the bottom line is, as long as by visuals the consumption and the benefit occurs simultaneously relatively, it's subject to Shemitah sanctity. But if there's a delay in benefit compared to its consumption, it's not liable for Shemitah sanctity. But we're not looking at, obviously, nanoseconds here. Otherwise, there's nothing to discuss. And you can have the same thing in terms of kashrut. In kashrut, if you can't see microscopic insects, it's technically kosher to eat. It has to be almost to the eye that you can't see the insects when you wash it out. It's not these microscopic things. It was a visual process. And we have a very similar concept when we were talking about kilayim, if you remember, that when the growth came, guys, where it was more than a quantity of 1 to 200, even at that point where kilayim didn't occur in the rest of the growth, and only the part where your vineyard and your grain intersected, that at that point the crossover became kilayim. It wouldn't affect the rest of the plant that never merged because they were separated by a wall, unless the growth occurred of 1 to 200 or more. But the interesting thing to note is if it was never noticed by a person, it didn't affect kilayim. It was only at the point where the person noticed it and never rectified it, and it made the growth of 1 to 200 ratio or more, did the effect come in terms of kilayim, with human almost consciousness of being aware that there was kilayim, which is different to a biochemical reaction that if you have, just hang on a second, guys, that if you have, for example, a chlorine bomb in the back of your bag and two chemicals mix and you blow up the bag, whether you're aware if chemicals joined creates some sort of a reactionary process is irrelevant to whether the person's watching or not. Whereas many of the halachic concepts are about human awareness of a particular factor. Okay, so let's go on to obviously the next discussion within this. Just give me 1 second, guys. Okay, so the Gemara has a question, and it says, and Gavin actually mentioned this the other day. Gavin said that at the end of the day, there's a problem because fire is not just used to cook. Fire is used for two other functions. And considering he didn't manage to do any sort of prep, his instincts are relatively good. It's not getting away with prep, but his instincts were asking the right questions. So imagine if you did the work, Gavin, how much more sharp you could be if you're this sharp without prep. So the thing of it is, he said, well, what do you talk about with flamage? He said it can cook food, it can also illuminate a place, and it can warm somebody up, which is a valid point. In other words, surely the function of why a fire is created would say there would be Shemitah sanctity or not. Because if there's no Shemitah sanctity in wood, because there's a delay where the benefit occurs after consumption, then in a case where you lit with a kerosene torch a piece of wood and you got the light immediately while the wood was being consumed, immediate benefit, not like cooking where you're sitting there on Sunday starving because the oak woke up late to charge the coals, and 40 minutes later you're hypoglycemic and nearly blasting the host. I'm saying the lighting benefit you get immediate. So therefore, why wouldn't that wood be susceptible to Shemitah sanctity? Or why, if you were being heated by a fire in a northern hemisphere winter and that was keeping you alive, wouldn't that would be susceptible to Shemitah sanctity? Are you with me, guys? You see how good the question is? In other words, surely their intent has got an effect of, in that case, because the consumption and the benefit are occurring simultaneously, surely there should be Shemitah sanctity then. And if it is, then you have to get rid of it when that wood is no longer available in the field due to either climatic conditions or the fact that the animal ate all the wood, and it's no longer it no longer is there in and of its own accord due to the perennial nature or due to the fact that it's going to take human intervention. So Gavin's question is dealt with in the Gemara at this particular point. The first thing that one has to know is that there's a principle that firstly, your question is raised both by Tosfot and Rashi, Gavin, so you're in good company, is that what we've got to look at is there's certain sources. The one of it is in Bereshis as to what the main purpose of fire is. And the main purpose of fire, well, if you ever look, there's two different opinions, interestingly enough, as to when Adam HaRishon. When we look at Rosh Hashanah, there's an opinion that Adam HaRishon was created in Tishrei. There's another opinion that the world was created in Nisan. Okay, there's different opinions in terms of whether it was when man was created, whether it was, there are different opinions. But according to both opinions, you've got a problem, and that opinion is that the fire at that stage is not going to be necessary to preserve human life. It's a nicety, but it's not a necessity, because if you look at the period of Tishrei, okay, then Tishrei is heading into, in the northern hemisphere, autumn. If you look in the southern hemisphere, it's heading into spring. If you look at Nisan, it's heading into spring in Israel and in the northern hemisphere, and in the southern hemisphere, you're looking at autumn. So either way, these are mild climatic conditions whereas where keeping warm is not essential to human life. And since it's not essential to human life, it's not essential that is meant for a main activity, as it's not a life-sustaining activity. Do you get what I'm saying, Gavin? In other words, and what does this have to do with fire? Is because when fire is first brought into the example of the sourcing, it's when Adam Arishon was created. He did the first sin, and then there was Havdalah, and flamage was mentioned at that particular time. So whether you take the Tishrei timeline or the Nisan timeline, either way, the main purpose of the fire was not for heat for survival, based on when the first fire was mentioned, but it was used for cooking. And was it used for light? Well, the thing of it is, the world was in a very, very different state. In that, if you look at the pre-Noach diluvian disaster, the world had sufficient light and climatic. Before there was tectonic plate shifting, you had almost a reasonable amount of light. Hashem also reserved the extra special light for the tzaddikim at the time of Gan Eden, etc. But initially, there was sufficient light. It's just we never merited keeping it. So you don't need it for light either, in terms of the first mention. So the primary use of fire is actually for food, for heating. And what's interesting enough is there was a book by Noel Avari called Sapiens. This was when there was the Naledi thing, that they found out that it wasn't just mankind that developed from Australopithecines to Cro-Magnon to Homo sapiens, etc., but there were other species of humans, so to speak. But either way, the notion was brought that what changed humans' cognitive development was the ability to cook starches and proteins, because there's a certain calorie intake. If you look at primates, and you have a case like Diane Fossey or people that studied gorillas, animals are eating all the time, especially primates, in order to get a certain nutritional value. They're eating all the time. But that nutritional value is just for physiological survival needs. But apes particularly eat all the time, and their cognitive abilities are superseding most other animals. But when man was able to cook food, etc., the development in terms of technologies and base use of tools improved significantly as a result of fire, because what it does is it changes the composition of food to where you're getting the right sort of nutritional balance, where you're not in purely physiological survival mode, and your cognitive processing can develop because you're getting more nutrition than what's technically needed for survival. So when it discusses the source with Tosfot and Bereshit, is Bereshit has set down the common usage of fire as the most common, and that is in order to cook food. And we discussed issues last time that, for example, Rabbi Zolzer mentioned that in certain brochas of food, it's about what the community commonly processes the food for. Is it used in its raw state or its cooked state? And the brocha can change according to if it's recognizable, if it's not. But sometimes a brocha is determined by the common use and not the unusual use. So one of the things that we're going to be dealing with is, number one, the intent of the gatherer. Number two, what is the common usage? So if the intent of the gatherer is different to common usage, does that supersede it? In other words, when you do brochas for food, is it your favorite food that gets predominance of a brocha? Is it the 7 species? Is it a food that's 8 compared to Adama? And there's a lot of complex factors. It's the same with the Gemara. Is it the intent of the individual of when you gather it? Is it the general common intent when you grow it? And that supersedes the individual intent. Is it a fact that, for example, that it has to do with its application? So, for example, there's certain things of Shemitah that are only allowed in other words, the criterion are twofold. What can get Shemitah sanctity? And the second criteria is what are the rules that constrain that Shemitah sanctity? In other words, Rashi uses this term, as we discussed last time, of using an object for business. So what does that mean, business? It's obviously on its base level, it's commercial selling of it. In other words, you can't use stuff that's picked in the Shemitah year, even though seeds were dropped in the 6th year, for commercial gain. You can use it to feed your own animals or your own food or animal fodder or dyestuffs, but you can't sell it on a commercial basis. That's the literal interpretation. The other interpretations, which Rashi means about doing business, is you can't endure its permanence. And that permanence is, what is business actually? You're taking a product that might have a sell-by date like bananas, and you're selling it in order to get money. Now, that money has permanence because it doesn't have a fraught date like fruit that will expire. And in turn, if you use that money and invest it well, you generate other money. So you grow it and you have some sort of longevity of the benefit as opposed to something that is perishable. And you can convert that money into other investments or buy houses that have a higher degree of permanence than even in currency. So one of the factors is about the Shemitah restriction is that it has to fall within the limitation of bi'ur, usage, to what's happening in the environment, but also that you can't use it for certain activities where the consumption is preceded by the benefit, and that is commercial activities like laundering, flax, etc., which we're going to go through when something has to be used for eating. So one of the other criteria is it has to match eating in terms of consumption, matching benefit, but also that you cannot use it for something mundane when you can do Kiddush out of it, such as eating, like using Kiddush wine to soften fabric. That you can't do right out. But even if it's wine grown not for human consumption, are you allowed to do such a thing as most people intend to have wine in order to have it for kiddush? So does the individual intend that you're growing the wine as a pickling agent for fabric, or the fact that the common usage is for Havdalah and therefore you can't use it for anything profane, etc., etc.? So we're going to go through all these issues. Guys, do you have any questions? Svi Hirsch, do you have any questions? I can't hear you guys. Kev?
Go off mute, guys.
Yeah, it was very good. Shkach. I heard a very good introduction there, mentatonics and pentatonics and everything. It was a very nice insight into the Gemara. Shkach, thank you.
Thank you. Listen, it's just all of us have a lot of fun learning together, and we keep up our learning. And the guys ask good questions. So if I don't prepare well, they throw fruit at me, which is perishable.
It was done. I mean, you're still not finished yet, so we got time.
Exactly. So, guys, it was lovely to see you. I hope the show made sense, but we're going to actually next time tackle a lot of the complexities of those restrictions and limitations.
Question: if I throw fruit on you on the 7th, it's not for whatever, is that allowed?
Yeah, and if it's only throw it at me in the 6th year.
Yeah, it's the 7th year because you're not going to consume it. It's just thrown.
All right, guys, listen, thank you very much. Listen, Hilton, I'm sure you've listened to Shir of a different level. It's just friends learning together. You've heard much, much better sharing, but the thing of it is just school friends getting together to learn.
I think it's different.
I can't hear Kevin. Kevin, I can't hear you guys.
I'm impressed. Very good. Very good. I'm impressed.
All right. Well, I miss you guys, and I'll see you. I'll see you soon. Gavin and I have to come to Israel, and then we can do a siyum one of these days. It would be nice. That's what we have to do.
100%.
On Monday night,
yeah,
I'm only available after 8 p.m. like 8. Let's say 8:20 p.m. Israel time, 7:20 South African time.
Okay, but we got the shir at 7:45 with Rav Schottenstein, and I have to give Gavin the call for Tuesday's training.
7:45 South African time.
Yeah, we got the shir from 7:45 to 8:45. So what do we do?
Can we have it earlier, maybe?
What time? Because Gavin generally does, there's Mincha and Marif, finishes at about 10 past
Yes,
6.
I sent it on a Monday.
What are you doing? Are you teaching, mate?
It's yeah, I have to go. I have to go. I have to catch. I have to go. It's not, and it's not. It's not near me. I have to go by bus, and it takes time to get there. You have to leave in advance, or go by bike. So
Well,
I'm
what about when
available.
we get back at 9 p.m. South African time? It's the best we can do. Because we keep
Yeah,
missing
yeah,
Shirin.
yeah, yeah.